I knew I was in trouble the second I heard the knock, not the friendly kind, but the sharp, bony-knuckled, entitled kind that rattles your door like it owes them money. I opened it to see Lorraine Needham standing on my porch in her floral blouse and HOA badge like it was a sheriff's star. Middle-aged, tan from artificial spray rather than sun, and with a haircut that looked like it demanded to speak to managers in 3 counties. Classic Karen energy, and unfortunately the president of our HOA, the Pleasant Hills Neighborhood Committee. Mr. Silas Langley, she snapped, arms crossed tight enough to cut off her own circulation. You've been warned. That barn of yours is an eyesore. I've given you 3 citations and a formal notice. I leaned against the doorframe and crossed my arms right back. It's not an eyesore, Lorraine. It's a functioning barn. It's on my property. It's been here since before the HOA was even formed. It doesn't match the community aesthetic, she said, like she was quoting scripture. Beige, white, or soft sage green. Those are the HOA-approved outbuilding colors. It's red, I said, like a barn. Because it is a barn. Then perhaps you should consider relocating to a farm, Mr. Langley, she sniffed, turning on her heel like she'd just delivered a mic drop. She marched down my driveway and climbed into her powder blue Lexus, the one she always parked slightly crooked like it was allergic to being within the lines. I watched her drive off, jaw tight. I'd already repainted the trim of the barn after her first citation and even replaced the roof shingles to match the HOA's bizarre Mediterranean revival guidelines. But the red paint? That was original. My father had painted it before I inherited the place. I wasn't going to change it just because some HOA queen didn't like the color. 2 days later, I found out just how far Lorraine was willing to go. It was around 6 in the morning when I stepped outside with my coffee. The morning fog was just starting to lift off the fields behind my house, and I was halfway to the barn when I stopped dead in my tracks. The front wall of the barn had been spray painted. Giant white letters, sloppy and angry, read, "Violation, remove this eyesore." I stared at it for a long moment, my coffee cooling in my hand. Then I walked closer, noticing the paint was still slightly wet in spots. And there, in the dirt next to the gravel path, were a set of heel prints. High-heeled, narrow, with a scratch at the toe like someone had stumbled. Lorraine wore heels every day. I'd seen her tottering around on them at HOA meetings, on sidewalk patrol, even at block parties in the grass like a baby giraffe on stilts. I knew those prints like I knew her smug little smile. I didn't call the police. Not yet. I just stood there, staring at the graffiti for a long time and made a promise to myself. She wanted a war? Fine. I'd give her one. But I wasn't going to throw the first punch. I was going to wait. Watch. Let her get comfortable. And when she least expected it, I'd return the favor. It didn't take long for her to get smug about it either. The next day, she walked past my fence with her little clipboard, gave me a fake smile, and waved. "Good morning, Mr. Langley. Lovely weather today." I didn't wave back. I just nodded, eyes locked on her face, trying to imagine the best way to make her regret ever picking a fight with me. That night, I reviewed the security footage. I'd installed a few motion sensor cameras around the barn after her 3rd citation, just in case she decided to get creative. Sure enough, the footage showed her sneaking up the gravel path at 2:30 in the morning, wearing a hoodie that did nothing to hide her awkward high-heeled gait. She looked around, pulled out a can of spray paint from her oversized Louis Vuitton knockoff, and went to work. I downloaded the footage and copied it onto a thumb drive. That was my insurance policy, but I wasn't ready to cash it in. Not yet. Instead, I started asking around, talking to neighbors. Turns out Lorraine had a history of going after anyone who didn't conform to her little Pleasant Hills vision. One guy got fined for having a flagpole that was too patriotic. Another was told to remove his Halloween decorations because they were too spooky. People were sick of her, but they were scared. She ran the HOA like it was her personal fiefdom, and no one wanted to poke the queen. Well, I wasn't scared. I just needed the right moment. And that moment came 3 nights later during a neighborhood HOA meeting. Lorraine stood at the front of the community clubhouse, lecturing us about the importance of aesthetic harmony while sipping from her lemon water like it was holy nectar. I waited until the meeting ended, then approached her with a calm smile. "Lorraine," I said, "would you mind stopping by my property tomorrow morning? I'd like to show you the repaint job I'm planning for the barn." Her eyes lit up. "Of course, Mr. Langley. That's the spirit. Let's make Pleasant Hills beautiful again." The next morning, I made sure to delay her with some phony design samples and color swatches. She left satisfied, thinking she'd finally broken me. And that night, I put phase 2 into motion. See, Lorraine's backyard sloped gently downward toward the drainage ditch that ran between our properties. During heavy rains, that ditch overflowed, and the runoff usually pooled harmlessly in the far corner of her garden. But with a little creative landscaping on my end, and a few strategically placed hoses and submersible pumps, well, let's just say I had a way to accelerate the process. I waited until 2 in the morning, when the neighborhood was dead quiet. I turned on the pumps, let the water flow gently but steadily, rerouting it over the berm and straight into Lorraine's backyard. It wasn't enough to cause real damage, just enough to turn her manicured lawn into a swampy mess. By dawn, it looked like a rice paddy. She came screaming onto my porch at 7:30 sharp, still in her robe and slippers, mascara smudged from sleep. "You flooded my yard," she shrieked. "You did this." I raised my eyebrows, sipping my coffee. "Proof?" I asked. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. "I know it was you." "Funny," I said, "kind of like how I know who painted my barn." Her face froze. I held up the thumb drive. "Security cam footage," I said. "Full frontal shot, Lorraine. High def. Night vision. High heels, hoodie, the whole criminal couture line." She tried to snatch it, but I pulled it back. "Try anything else," I said, "and I hand this over to the sheriff's department." She stared at me, eyes wide, mouth twitching. Then she turned and stormed off, slipping slightly in the mud that used to be her herb garden. I closed the door, leaned back, and laughed for the first time in days. But that was just round 1. Because I wasn't done exposing Lorraine Needham or her precious HOA. No, I had plans. And the next one was going to take her entire empire down. The morning after Lorraine's backyard turned into a marshland, I figured she'd go into damage control mode. Maybe call a landscaper, maybe even try to guilt-trip some sympathetic neighbors. But I underestimated just how deep her obsession with control went. By noon, she'd taped up soggy, official HOA notices across the neighborhood bulletin board claiming there had been an overnight act of eco-vandalism and that the HOA was launching an internal investigation. I walked my dog past the board deliberately just to see the absurdity of it pinned up next to a flyer for a lost cat and a pancake breakfast. Eco-vandalism? That was a new one. I didn't react publicly. I didn't need to. Word about the barn graffiti had started circulating thanks to a few well-placed conversations I'd had with neighbors after showing them the footage. I never mentioned who did it, just that I had video of someone trespassing and vandalizing private property. People could connect the dots on their own. But Lorraine wasn't taking any chances. The very next day, I got a letter delivered by hand, not mailed, slipped under my door with the HOA's clunky gold logo at the top. It claimed my property was under review for possible non-compliance with several obscure clauses, including unauthorized irrigation structures and disruptive terrain modifications. I laughed out loud when I read that one. Disruptive terrain? That was rich coming from a woman who once tried to fine a neighbor for planting sunflowers that grew taller than allowed. I tucked the letter into a folder already bulging with her paper trail and made a decision. I was done playing defense. That afternoon, I drove to the county records office. Quiet place, smelled like old carpet and toner. The clerk, a man named George with an enviable mustache and the patience of a monk, helped me pull property development records for the entire Pleasant Hills subdivision. I found what I was looking for in a dusty box labeled HOA Amendments Initial Filing. Lorraine had filed a zoning exemption 3 years ago to expand her backyard patio, supposedly for community entertaining. What she actually did was pour a concrete slab twice the permitted size and install a semi-permanent trellis structure that encroached on the protected runoff zone, ironically, the same area where her yard now looked like a frog habitat. The kicker? That exemption had never been approved by the city. It had been rubber-stamped by the former HOA secretary, a man who conveniently moved out a year later and sold his house to Lorraine's cousin for half the market value. I cross-checked signatures. They didn't match. Not even close. Forgery. Unauthorized construction. Environmental code violations. I left the records office with a photocopy of everything and a tight sense of satisfaction growing in my chest. I wasn't just going to win this war, I was going to bury her in her own paperwork. Back home, I made several calls. One to the city zoning board. Another to the environmental compliance department. And, just for good measure, a third to a local attorney named Marissa Alvarez. Marissa was a friend of my sister's. She'd once taken on a crooked neighborhood association that tried to evict a disabled veteran over a wheelchair ramp. She didn't just win, she rewrote their entire charter in the process. We met at her office the next day. A cozy converted Victorian on Main Street with ivy crawling up one side and a paralegal who offered me lemon bars while I waited. After reviewing the documents, Marissa leaned back in her chair and gave me a slow nod. "This is gold," she said. She violated zoning, forged a regulatory signature, and used her position to benefit personally. That's not just grounds for removal. It's criminal. So what do? We file a formal complaint with the city, request a cease and desist on any further HOA enforcement actions, and submit a petition for a full audit of the HOA's operations. If she's been this sloppy here, I guarantee there's more. By the time I returned home that evening, Lorraine had already escalated. A bright orange notice was zip-tied to my mailbox, an emergency compliance order demanding I remove unauthorized piping immediately or face daily fines. I didn't even bother removing it. I left it flapping in the wind like a flag of her desperation. The next 48 hours were a blur of door knocks and phone calls. Word of the audit had spread fast. Turns out several homeowners had been fined over the years for ludicrous reasons, one woman for having a wind chime that Lorraine claimed was spiritually disruptive. Another man had been cited for excessive lawn gnome placement. When I attended the emergency HOA meeting 3 nights later, the community clubhouse was packed. People who hadn't shown up in months were suddenly present, arms crossed, expressions tight. Lorraine stood at the front as usual, but she looked rattled. Her hair was pulled back too tight, and her voice faltered every few sentences. "We are here," she announced, "to address a recent smear campaign being conducted against the HOA and myself personally. Let me assure you these accusations are baseless and politically motivated." I raised my hand. "You're not elected, Lorraine. There's no politics." She ignored me and kept going. "Someone has submitted forged documents to city officials in an attempt to discredit this organization." I stepped forward, holding up the zoning documents. "These aren't forged." "But yours are." Gasps rippled through the room. I handed copies to the HOA treasurer and the vice president, an older woman named Janice who had never liked Lorraine but always kept her head down. "This is a copy of the original zoning regulations. This," I held up the second sheet, "is the altered exemption Lorraine filed. Compare the signatures." Janice squinted at them. Her mouth tightened. "Is this true?" she asked. Lorraine didn't answer. A murmur moved through the crowd. People started asking questions, voices rising. Lorraine tried to regain control, raising her hands, but it was too late. Someone shouted from the back, "What about the HOA funds? Where's all the money going?" That opened the floodgates. Accusations flew. Misappropriated dues. Unauthorized charges for community improvements no one remembered approving. A few neighbors pulled out their own letters and citations, waving them like war trophies. Janice finally banged a gavel. "Meeting adjourned. We're calling for a vote of no confidence." Lorraine tried to protest, but her voice was swallowed by the crowd. People weren't afraid anymore. Not after seeing her exposed. The next morning, I got a call from Marissa. The city had issued a stop-work order on Lorraine's patio and opened a formal investigation into misappropriation of HOA funds. The police were involved now, not just code enforcement. That afternoon, a detective showed up at Lorraine's house. He was calm, professional, and carried a folder thick with paperwork. She didn't answer the door for 10 minutes. When she finally did, she looked pale. Her voice trembled as she spoke to him, and though I couldn't hear the words, I knew the tone. It was the sound of a matriarch watching her castle crumble. Within a week, she resigned due to health reasons. No apology, no admission, just a typed letter taped to the clubhouse bulletin board. Janice was appointed interim president. One of her first actions? Throwing out the HOA's entire violation database and calling a third-party auditor to review every financial transaction for the past 5 years. The barn stayed red. And Lorraine's backyard? Still soggy. Turns out removing that illegal patio would take weeks, and the runoff had permanently altered the drainage flow. She put her house up for sale the following month. As for me, I kept the footage. And the documents. Just in case someone else ever got any ideas about trying to play queen in Pleasant Hills again. A week after Lorraine's resignation, Pleasant Hills felt different. Lighter. Like the entire neighborhood had been holding its breath for 3 years and finally exhaled. The clubhouse parking lot wasn't filled with her Lexus blocking 2 spaces. Her laminated notices about mailbox paint tones had disappeared from the bulletin board. People even started waving again, real waves, not the stiff, wary kind we'd all gotten used to. Still, I knew something didn't sit right. Janice had taken over, sure, and the city had started its audit, but something about Lorraine's sudden resignation and the vague health reasons she gave didn't explain everything. She hadn't just broken the rules, she'd bent them until they cracked. And people like her didn't walk away unless they were hiding something worse. 3 days after her departure, I went to drop off a copy of the zoning violation records to Marissa, who had taken a particular interest in the audit. She greeted me with a mug of chicory coffee and a raised brow. "I've been digging," she said, sliding a folder across her desk toward me. Turns out Lorraine wasn't just mismanaging HOA funds. She was diverting a portion of the annual maintenance budget into a consulting firm that doesn't exist. The checks were made out to a company called Greenway Solutions. "Sounds real enough," I said. "It would be if the address didn't trace back to a P.O. box in a strip mall 2 towns over." And guess who filed the LLC paperwork? I didn't have to guess. She tapped the printout. Her niece, who, according to tax records, lives in the same house Lorraine bought for her cousin. I leaned back. So she set up a fake company, funneled association money into it, and probably skimmed thousands over the years. "At least 22,000, Marissa said. "That's what we've found so far." And that's just on the books. That explained the new patio furniture she'd bragged about last spring. And the outdoor kitchen nobody else was allowed to use during HOA cookouts. "You're planning to press charges?" I asked. Marissa nodded. "Already filed. The city's fraud division is involved now. They're coordinating with the county prosecutor. If we're lucky, a grand jury will be looking at this by the end of the month." That should have been enough for me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't reached the bottom of this yet. Later that afternoon, I ran into Don Carpenter, a retired electrician who lived 3 houses down from Lorraine's place. He was sitting on a folding chair in his driveway, oiling the gears of an ancient lawnmower. His arms were tanned and wiry, and he had a way of talking like every word had to be earned. "She wasn't just pocketing cash," he said, not looking up from the mower. "She was collecting favors." "What do you mean?" I asked. "She got my neighbor a permit to expand his garage 2 feet over the limit. Quiet deal, no paperwork. In exchange, he installed a new breaker box at her place, off the books. A week later, she fined another guy for putting up a shed without approval. Same shed, same size. Selective enforcement?" He nodded. "And then some. If you were useful, she let things slide. If you weren't, She bled you dry. It explained why some people had gotten away with things others hadn't, why Lorraine's cousin's boat never got towed despite being parked on the street for a month, while another neighbor got fined for a sagging basketball net. Back at home, I dug through the HOA's public records. Janice had released copies of the last 5 years of meeting minutes and financial reports. Most of it was the usual dry nonsense: budgets, landscaping quotes, maintenance schedules, but one entry caught my eye. A line item from 18 months ago marked emergency legal consultation, $3,800. That stood out. I didn't remember any emergency, legal or otherwise. I called Marissa again. Got another one for you, I said. Can you find out who that payment went to? 2 days later, she called back. That check, she said, was written to a law firm that no longer exists. It dissolved a year ago, and guess who was the registered agent? Don't tell me. Lorraine's brother-in-law. Disbarred 5 years ago for falsifying documents in a zoning case. She used him to fabricate legal threats against homeowners who pushed back too hard, including, apparently, one guy who tried to file a motion to dissolve the HOA. I whistled low. That guy still live here? Nope. Sold his place for a loss and moved out 6 months ago. Probably thought it wasn't worth the fight. That made me angrier than anything. Lorraine hadn't just been a tyrant, she'd driven people out, ruined home values, and manipulated the legal system to protect her power. I decided it was time to visit her. Her house sat quiet, the blinds drawn. A for sale sign tilted sideways on the lawn, the real estate flyer box already empty. I rang the doorbell and waited. Nothing. I knocked once firmly. Still nothing. As I turned to leave, a voice called from across the street. She moved out 2 nights ago, said a man in a faded work shirt leaning against his truck. U-Haul showed up around midnight. No lights, no noise. Just packed and gone. Where'd she go? He shrugged. Didn't say. But she left a dumpster full of junk in the driveway. Might still be something useful in there. I walked over. Most of it was broken furniture and water-damaged boxes. But near the bottom, behind a cracked mirror and a stack of rotting curtain rods, I spotted a plastic filing crate. The kind you get from an office supply store. Inside were manila folders, some swollen from moisture, others still sealed. I pulled it out and took it home. That night, I went through every folder. Most were boring contractor quotes, landscaping invoices, HOA newsletters from years ago. But buried in the middle was a folder labeled Privileged Do Not Discard. Inside were 2 typed letters, both unsigned, addressed to Mr. Haskett, County Land Commission. They referenced a proposal to reroute neighborhood runoff via a buried pipe system that would reduce flooding in community areas. The proposal included a request for retroactive approval of a drainage modification near the southwest corner of Pleasant Hills. That was my property. The letter was dated 8 months prior, 2 months after Lorraine had threatened me about the barn, and 4 months before I found her spray paint job. She tried to reroute runoff from her yard into mine. Not just with hoses or tricks, she wanted it done officially, legally. And when the commission didn't respond, she did it anyway. One of the attached diagrams showed an altered drainage map. The new lines crossed my boundary, cutting through my east field and reconnecting to the ditch farther down. It would have turned my back acres into a seasonal swamp every rainy season. I stared at the signature box. It was blank. She'd never submitted it. Maybe she'd been waiting for the right moment. Or maybe she realized it was too risky. Either way, she'd planned to use county resources to solve a problem she created and dump the consequences on me. I sent the files to Marissa. An hour later, she called. This just turned into environmental fraud. That drainage diagram? If she'd submitted it, she would have violated at least 3 state land use regulations. And the fact that she started construction without approval? That's a felony. She's already skipped town. She won't be gone long. I've forwarded everything to the county investigator. They'll issue a warrant if they haven't already. 2 days later, it was official. Lorraine Needham was wanted for questioning in connection with multiple counts of wire fraud, zoning violations, and falsification of public documents. Her image flashed across the local news during the 6 o'clock report. They used her HOA portrait, the one where she wore that ridiculous white blazer and looked like she was about to host a daytime courtroom show. The neighborhood watched from their porches, bowls of popcorn in hand. Someone even set up a projector on their garage and streamed the news. When the anchor said authorities are asking anyone with additional information to come forward, half the block nodded. 3 weeks later, they caught her in a rental cabin outside Asheville. Alone, broke, and trying to sell fake antiques online. Pleasant Hills held a neighborhood potluck the following weekend. Janice grilled burgers. Don Carpenter brought a cooler full of root beer. I brought a tray of cornbread. People laughed again. Kids rode bikes up and down the street without being told their helmets were too bright. Nobody mentioned Lorraine. We didn't need to. The barn still stood, red and proud. I added a weather vane to the roof last week, a little copper rooster that turns with the wind. A reminder, not just of what we'd survived, but of how we'd taken it back. A month passed since the potluck, and Pleasant Hills had begun to settle into something that resembled peace. The HOA, now under Janice's interim leadership, had shifted into a quiet state of reform. Meetings were held with transparency, financials were posted online, and homeowners once too nervous to speak up were now openly discussing ideas for improvement instead of ducking behind hedges when the board drove by. But even with Lorraine gone and facing a mile-long list of charges back in the county she tried to strong-arm, Marissa and I weren't ready to shut the book just yet. We were still waiting on the results of the deep audit Janice had ordered. The third-party firm, a small but sharp outfit from 2 towns over, had been combing through every receipt, invoice, and bank statement the HOA had ever processed. And the more they pulled back the curtain, the more they found. The first real bombshell came in the form of a maintenance contract. Marissa came by my place on a windy Thursday afternoon, wearing a leather jacket and holding an envelope like it contained a live wire. "You're going to want to see this," she said, stepping inside. I cleared a spot on the dining room table and she laid out a stack of photocopies. The top sheet was a vendor agreement, routine stuff at first glance, but the details were where it got ugly. Lorraine signed a 5-year landscaping contract with a business that was registered to her nephew, she said. No bidding process, no community vote, and the charges were inflated almost double the going rate. I flipped through the pages. Let me guess, the work was barely done. Barely at all. They mowed the entrance flower beds once a month and billed like they were maintaining a golf course. The audit firm estimates nearly $12,000 was siphoned just from that one contract. That alone would have been bad enough. But Marissa wasn't finished. "There's more," she added, pulling out another paper. This one was a list of disbursements from the HOA's emergency fund. Over the past 2 years, Lorraine had withdrawn cash, real, physical cash, from the fund on 9 separate occasions. Each entry was labeled with vague notations like Community Repair Reserve or Legal Contingency. "There's no record of how the cash was used," Marissa said. "That's not just mismanagement. That's embezzlement." And it didn't stop there. The audit also uncovered a second set of books. A handwritten ledger tucked away in a drawer of the clubhouse office that even Janice didn't know existed. It listed names, dollar amounts, and what appeared to be favors, some crossed out, others with check marks. One entry read, J. Pickering easement sign-off $600 complete. Another, C. Bellshed variance $300 pending. Bribes. Small scale, maybe, but systematic. And they painted a picture of a woman who hadn't just bent the rules, she'd built a private empire out of them. Marissa reported everything to the county prosecutor's office. The detective assigned to Lorraine's case added the new evidence to the existing charges. What had started as zoning violations and forgery had now grown into a full-fledged fraud case: wire fraud, racketeering, misuse of public funds, and criminal conspiracy. The prosecutor formally charged Lorraine with 27 counts. The potential sentence? Over 20 years if convicted. Back in Pleasant Hills, the neighborhood rallied. A group of residents formed a temporary oversight committee to help Janice transition into a permanent leadership role. They rewrote the bylaws to include term limits, mandatory transparency measures, and a homeowner recall provision. The new rules required all contracts to be publicly posted and approved by vote. And most importantly, they eliminated the clause that gave the HOA president unilateral enforcement authority, Lorraine's favorite weapon. One Saturday morning, I received a letter. Not from the HOA, but from the county court. I'd been listed as a primary witness in the criminal trial. The footage of Lorraine trespassing and vandalizing the barn had become a key piece of evidence not just for the vandalism charge, but for establishing her pattern of retaliation against dissenting residents. The trial began 2 months later. It was held in the county courthouse, a red brick building with heavy oak doors and a stiff sense of formality. Lorraine sat at the defendant's table, her expression hollow. No hair dye. No designer blouse. Just a gray blazer that made her look smaller than I remembered. I testified on the second day. The prosecutor asked about the barn, the citations, the graffiti, and the water runoff incident. I told the truth, the whole truth, and then some. When I described the moment I found the spray paint on the barn, Lorraine looked away. When I explained how she tried to reroute drainage onto my land using falsified documents, she pressed her lips together so hard they practically vanished. Marissa testified the next day, walking the court through the financial records and the fake maintenance contracts. Don Carpenter testified after her, confirming how Lorraine had selectively enforced rules and bartered favors in exchange for services. By the end of the week, the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 16 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 10. The courtroom was silent as she was led away, wrists cuffed, expression unreadable. Back in Pleasant Hills, life moved on. The barn, now freshly repainted in the same deep red as my father had used decades ago, stood as a quiet symbol of what we'd been through. I added a new sign to the gatepost, private property protected under county easement law. Not because I needed the warning anymore, but because it made me smile every time I passed it. Janice was officially elected as the new HOA president in a special vote. She appointed Don as vice president. His first order of business was to propose a community garden in the empty lot where Lorraine once staged her so-called aesthetic inspections. At the first meeting under new leadership, neighbors brought baked goods and folding chairs. The whole event felt more like a picnic than a board meeting. People laughed. Kids ran around barefoot. Someone even brought a guitar. Nobody mentioned Lorraine. She was gone. Not just from the neighborhood, but from the shadow she'd cast over it. The HOA, once a tool of control and intimidation, had been reclaimed by the people who actually lived there. As the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the grass, I stood by the barn and listened to the quiet. A real quiet, not the kind that came from fear, but the kind that came from peace. We hadn't just won. We'd rebuilt. And this time we were going to do it right.